Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Weaning and Beyond. My name's Jodie Rizzo-O'Brien and I'm part of the SheepConnect South Australia team. Today's webinar is being recorded and we'll upload that recording to the SheepConnect SA YouTube channel in the coming days. We welcome you to revisit the webinar yourself or share it with colleagues. Today's presenter is Deb Scammell. Deb is a livestock consultant at Talking Livestock based in the Mid-North. She assists producers with nutrition and production planning in their sheep and beef enterprises. Over the last few years, Deb's been keenly involved in improving performance in lamb feedlots and feeding use and containment due to the poor seasonal conditions. Prior to starting her own business, Talking Livestock, Deb worked in the commercial nutrition space in several different roles, covering technical, sales and national management of ruminant business. Deb has also been involved with sheep genetic programs, EID tech and extension and sheep research. At this time, I'll hand over to Deb, who talked to us about weaning and beyond. Thanks, Deb.
Thanks very much. So tonight we're going to be talking on weaning and weaner management. So tonight I'll be starting on the weaning process. So how we go about weaning to reduce stress and get a successful result over that period. We'll also touch on imprinting, so getting animals used to feed types and the rumen development associated with that. We'll touch on growth rates and some targets post-weaning and also targets for weaning weights. And then I'll also talk a little bit about paddock feed and your weaner feed requirements. So as Jodie said, feel free to type some questions in the chat or ask me questions at the end if you're not clear on anything I've covered. But first, I just wanted to touch on when your weaners should be weaned and what nutrition they're getting from milk and what % they're sort of getting from pasture. So this is a fairly published sort of slide that's been around for quite a while, but what we see is as weaners get older, towards that 12 to 14 week mark, the percentage of nutrition they're actually getting from milk is a very low proportion of their overall nutrition. So as you can see from sort of 2 weeks of age, they'll start to transition on pasture, quickly and depending on how much they're getting from milk. So a twin lamb, for example, will start getting onto pasture a bit early if they're not getting quite enough milk, but your typical single will follow that path that we've shown there. So as we move on, I'll talk about sort of weaning time. So keep that in mind, that as they are getting older, you're actually not taking much away by taking them off that milk source. So the key point I wanted to make tonight is weaning is really just managing stress of the animal. So I guess when people talk about weaning, we see all types of things. So, most people I ask sort of how they wean initially, they're sort of like, we're just drafting off the animal. So I guess when you think about stress for a weaner, just drafting animals off, putting them on a new paddock. So often I find, ewes and lambs will be grazing hills or they'll be somewhere on sort of native pastures, maybe some sown feed or an established pasture, but often the lambs will be drafted off, we put them onto a different water source, sometimes on a truck, different feed source, totally different environment. So the difficult thing about that is the stress response that occurs to weaning. So I like to think of weaning, you've just got to try and think of ways you can reduce stress and introduce them to as many of those things as possible before taking their mum away. So you imagine a young lamb, spent its whole life sort of following its mum around the paddock to that 14-week sort of period. So we're trying to use the mum to expose them to as many things as possible. So the only change is the mum being taken away rather than their whole life changing on that day. So I guess, as I said, we see some really good weaning programs and some probably less than ideal weaning programs. But what we're trying to avoid is this real stress response to weaning that you see. So weaning done badly, you'll see that real decrease in appetite. So, if they're thrown on a totally different type of feed, they're sort of running around, they're looking for their mum, they're calling out, you'll find they stop eating. The rumen also doesn't work as effectively, so you've got that decreased nutrient absorption. Often they'll urinate and defecate a bit more, so you find they get quickly dehydrated, and then you'll also get immune suppression. So basically by reducing stress, we're trying to reduce that real stress response and that cycle they get on where they really can't get off. So, I guess when I look at a successful weaning, we're trying to put weight on immediately post-weaning. Where weaning done badly, we see scarring animals, bad immunity, health issues, decreased growth rates, and, worst case scenario, animals can lose a substantial amount of weight over that weaning period. So that's what we're trying to avoid. So touching on as well, when you're looking at this weaning period, also considering sort of your health issues. So weaning time should be your booster for your 3-in-1 or 6-in-1 vaccination, but a real importance is that pulpy kidney coverage that comes with that second vaccination, because often weaners do go through a bit of a feed change. So, they might be on slightly different feed just prior to weaning or over the weaning period. So they need to have that booster so they don't get a pulpy kidney challenge. As I said, with the stress response, their immunity does go down. So things like worm burdens can have a major effect on a young weaner. So I'd encourage you to do a worm egg count, a couple of weeks prior to weaning of ewes and lambs, see what your burdens are like, and then give an effective drench. So, a compound you don't have any resistance to, or a, dual or triple drench is normally more effective. And also acidosis. So we'll talk a little bit about imprinting, but making sure you're not, suddenly putting them onto a high grain ration. So as they're stressed, immunity's gone down. Any small health challenge can become sort of a major event in a weaner's life. So what may not affect an older animal will likely have a much bigger effect on a weaner. So keep in mind your health challenges. So when we talk about imprint feeding, there's 2 reasons why we do imprint feeding. So the most important thing is training. So what we're looking at is training the lamb using the ewe. So if post-weaning your lambs at some point are going to go onto a self-feeder of grain, or you're going to be trial feeding them as ewe replacements the following year, I'd prefer them to be introduced to that feed type with their mothers. So there's plenty of research that's shown animals that are introduced with their mothers to, self-feeders, trial feed, will eat a substantial amount more of that supplement throughout the rest of their life. And they've shown, up to 3 years later, if they're introduced again, they'll eat a substantial amount more of that supplementary feed than an animal that's never been trained with their mother. So I can't emphasise enough how important that is. And also, so we're looking at the same feed type, feed method, and also training them to similar water troughs, feed, everything like that is crucial. Electric fencing with their mother if you're going to be putting them in electric fence paddocks as weaners. So train them as much as you can prior to that weaning phase. So when we talk imprint feeding, we're also going to talk a little bit about rumen development that occurs. So when we're looking at the rumen development over the weaning period, you need a starch-based feed to really speed up that rumen development. So starch-based feeds, wheat with caution, barley, oats can still be effective, but we do want some grains with starch in it. So it doesn't need to be a huge amount of feeding to train the lamb. So, especially with a bit of the dry start, a lot of stock have been fed grain prior to lambing this year. So most of your ewes should be quite trained. So, I find trail feeding sort of 3 times prior to weaning. Most of the lambs will run to the trail and be having a bit of a nibble. Or put your self feeder out sort of a couple of weeks prior to weaning, just lock down again, just to retrain the lambs, even if your ewes don't need feed. And then, if you're just using it for training purposes, continue to feed sort of 3 times post-weaning. Can be just 200 to 300 grams per animal per day. But if you're needing it for nutritional reasons, obviously you'd leave your self feeder out or continue that feeding. But when we talk about rumen development, so what we look at on the wall of the rumen is increasing the surface area of the rumen wall, basically increases the feed efficiency of that animal, and it allows more surface area for sort of nutrient absorption in that on that rumen wall. So what's on the left, so this work was done years ago by Penn State University. So the rumen wall on the left only had milk prior to weaning. The one in the middle had milk and grain. So you can see there, you get that real raised papillae that has drastically increased the surface area of that rumen wall. And the one on the far right is milk and hay. So you've had a little bit of a formation of papillae, but it is that starch-based feed that has that real effect on the surface area of the rumen wall. So the benefit of animals that are introduced to starch-based feeds prior to that weaning period, so have been on starch-based feeds with their mother, is that when they come back onto grain later in life, they generally introduce to it better, but also have more feed efficiency and generally do better on a grain-based, starch-based diet later on in life. So, whether they're replacement ewe lambs that you're likely to keep, or wethers that you might want to finish with, either full grain ration or a bit of grain, I can't emphasise enough the importance of getting that rumen developed early. So imprint feeding, I think we see two benefits. So the training of the stock, but also the rumen development. And when we talk later about pasture and sort of adjustment to new feed for weaners, having any continuity of feed type is really helpful for introducing them to a new feed. So, even if you've got a good quality pasture, continuing a little bit of grain on until they adjust to that new feed just allows the animal to undergo that adjustment within the rumen successfully. So when we look at weaning time, there's many reasons why people wean, and there's no real set rule of when you should be weaning. So, industry recommendations are 14 weeks from the start of lambing, but that's presuming we're doing a relatively short joining. So, industry recommendations are also to do a 5-week joining just to cover 2 cycles, which I'm a strong advocate for, because it allows you to wean in a timely fashion where, if you're joining over 7, 8, 9 weeks, you always have those late lambs that hold up your marking and then follow on, hold up your weaning program. So, the reasons we're likely to wean, so, looking at 14 weeks after the start of lambing over a 4 to 5 week joining, you've got your 12-week average sort of lamb. But another reason we often wean is when feed quality is limited. So when we look at the feed consumption of a ewe with a lamb at foot, it's a substantial quantity of feed compared to just a weaned lamb on its own. So, a weaned lamb on its own is often only eating sort of a kilo dry matter a day, where your ewe and lamb unit could be eating 2 to 3 times that. So when we have pasture of low, limited high quality pasture, it's better for us to reserve that for the weaners. So it can mean putting the ewes back on another paddock and weaning a little bit earlier. The other time is if ewes are losing fat score. So, obviously north, there's still, substantial areas that are quite dry. So we've unfortunately once again hit that situation where we don't have enough supplementary feed to keep ewes and lambs going. So it can be better just to feed the lamb and put the ewe on some lower quality feed, because they just you can't keep feeding both of them to keep the ewes fat to feed the lambs. It can become more economical just to feed the lamb. So ewes that have twins or triplets, similar situation, earlier weaning can allow you to grow those twins or triplets out more effectively. As we said, early weaning, if you've got that early rumen development, they've had that starch-based feed, they will thrive a lot better post-weaning process, especially if they're a bit younger. But yeah, as we'll go through some data, so the standard recommendation is to wean at 45% of your standard reference weight, and a minimum of sort of 40% standard reference weight to make sure you've got high levels of weaner survivability, So standard reference weight of a ewe, if you don't know what it is, there's some information on the AWI website, but it's basically just the mature weight of a ewe when it's fair shorn and in condition score 3. So if you don't have a standard reference weight of a ewe flock, I encourage you to get someone to help you condition score them if you're not sure how to. Weigh them when they're non-pregnant, off shears, or if they've got 3 months or 6 months wool, you can take off the applicable wool weight, and that'll give you a standard reference weight. So when we talk targets, we often refer back to that standard reference weight. So yeah, a good way to look at your target weaning weight is that 45% of standard reference weight. But yeah, so I guess the point of this slide is your 14 weeks is your target, but if feed quality is limited, you use or losing too much condition, you can definitely wean earlier and still have a very successful result. So there's people that started kind of early weaning through the drought and have found that it's quite an effective tool, allows them to have better quality feed for longer for weaners. So it's something they've continued doing. So, you know, any time from 8 weeks on is fine if they're managed carefully. So I guess looking at maximum time that we'd wean, it all comes back to the ewe as well. So weaning's not just about the lamb, but it's also about the ewe. So obviously when that ewe successfully got the 1 or 2 or 3 lambs on the ground for us, we're looking at that lactation period to get maximum growth into that lamb. And then on that top chart, you can see a timely weaning at 14 weeks post-lambing gives that ewe 17 weeks recovery time through to the following year's joining. So having 17 weeks enables them to sort of lose a bit of condition through the lactation period, pick up a condition score and get back up to your pre-joining target. And it gives us the most successful chance of rejoining and having a positive result the following year. So, you know, we look at plenty of situations. We've got the pregnancy, the bottom slide, 20 weeks of lactation, and that only then gives you 11 weeks recovery time. So that will have a flow-on effect. Your ewes may not be back in condition, or you might have a higher percent dries at the following joining. So worth keeping in mind the ewes as well. But back to the lambs. So when we look at merino weaner lambs, we're looking at, as an industry, we're targeting 95% survival of weaners through to 1 year of age. I've probably got a higher target than that, so I want to make sure you're well above that 95%. So that would be my absolute lowest figure of weaner survival in a merino sort of weaner. And we can do it by concentrating on weights and also growth rates of those weaners at weaning. So when we look at weaner health, the issue with weaners, basically we call it ill thrift. So it's that percentage of weaners that struggle to survive and thrive. So they're often those lower weight weaners, so they're often a bit small when they are weaned, you know, maybe a bit shy feeders. They always look a bit average and sort of just always just that tail of that mob. So they're the ones you'll find potentially won't make it through to 12 months of age. So these slides come from Weaning with Weaners, which is a really good half-day workshop that AWI have developed, that if anyone's interested in being involved around or probably just prior to weaning, either this year or next year, you can contact either myself or Jodie. But some of the data they've used in this, so what we see is there actually is a long-term effect of low live weight, not so much at weaning, but through to 9 months of age. So often if weaners are weaned a bit light and they're not fed enough to have an improved growth rate to get them up to targets, so I guess not actively managed, we find it will have an ongoing effect on their net reproduction rate. So when we talk net reproduction rate of, you know, replacement ewe lambs, we're basically just talking number of lambs they wean from a standard hogget joining, so from 2 to 6 years of age, so over that 4-year period. So this data came out of Trangie Research Flock, and they were monitored. There was 2 mobs. C flock was just over 2,000 ewes and D flock was 1,800 ewes. And you can see there, so we've basically ranked the lambs on the lowest live weight at weaning. So we've got 28.4 and 26.9, and then their net reproduction rate was only 1.6, and then 1 lambs over that 4-year period. So they broke them then into the middle weights, which is your average sort of live weights, and you can see a substantial lift there. So 3 lambs over that 4 years and 3.8 lambs over the 4 years for the D flock. And then the top 25% on live weight, so sorry, that was at 9 months of age, 30 and 28 kilos. You've got then the 5.6 and 4.8 lambs over that 4 years. So it's not just the average weaners and, you know, for that 12 months, but there actually is an ongoing sort of effect of those animals not hitting targets during that first 12 months of life. So, yeah, and obviously, you know, we're looking to keep ewes and put replacements into our flocks that are that high net reproductive performance rather than that lower level where they're just scraping in with all of the targets. So when we look at weaning weight, so I guess mobs where I see a high percentage of deaths, it often is when that weaning weight is well below that 40%. So, you know, we've had a really late break in SA in most areas this year, and also those patches just haven't received some rainfall. And, you know, with the cold, I think we've been chasing the 8 ball a bit with feed this year. So, you know, I've probably seen a lot of lambs coming up to weaning that are probably a little bit under ideal weight. So the risk of these animals is if you do get them well below this 40% of standard reference weight, you'll be sitting in that light 25%, and, you know, your deaths can be up over that 10% mark. So the heavier we can get them, you can see there, the heaviest 25%, you're getting down to under 4% death rate. So that data's come out of the same trial that was done in Trangie. So the key message is, I guess, is to monitor your weaning weight. If you know you're only at 35% of your standard reference weight, so you're well below where you want to be, you actually can make up for it by managing those weaners very carefully. So as I said, through droughts, and, you know, I've got plenty of people that are still continuing to early wean. So we know we don't have the body weight on those animals, but by giving them targeted nutrition and ensuring they have a least stressful sort of weaning period, they're adjusted to feed, they've been on the water, they've seen the paddock, there's no stress, they continue to grow, means you can combat that mortality risk of a light weaner. So we've got here these 4 groups. So we've got your weaning weights there. So you can see you've got sort of high and low weaning weights there. But group 1, you know, reasonable weaning weight, quite high post-weaning growth rate. So that's 4 to 8 weeks after weaning. Mortality's pretty close to 0%. The next mob, you know, quite a light weaning weight at only 18 kilos, but nearly double the post-weaning growth rate. So with adequate nutrition, you can easily hit those levels of post-weaning growth rate or even higher, and 0 mortality in that mob, back to a reasonable weaning weight, but they've actually lost weight post-weaning. So, you know, losing 9.7 grams a day is pretty common in a not very well thought out weaning program, and they've got 11.2% mortality in there. Back to some light weaners with just average post-weaning growth rate, and you're up to 7% mortality. So I guess the key message from here is, if you do wean early or at lower weaning weights, so often there's a spread across your weaners. I encourage you, even now, if you weaned a month ago, draft off those lighter weaners and put them on more targeted nutrition, put them on a better paddock, put them in smaller mobs, and make sure you're getting those high post-weaning growth rates, and they can still then be a successful, you know, wether lamb or replacement ewe lamb for you down the track. So it's just managing actively those weaners. We've got here your growth rate target, so post-weaning growth rate target, and this also is from Weaning with Weaners, so it's based on merinos. So you can see there you've got that real high mortality risk, but once you get to sort of 50 grams per head per day and over, your mortality starts to reduce. So, you know, in my mind, 50 grams per head per day is the absolute minimum you'd want to be growing out a weaner. So, you know, personally, I'd be looking at 100 grams or even more. So, you know, you're looking at then only 700 grams a week. So plenty of people will be growing weaners out quicker than that. So, yeah, it's targeting, reducing stress, targeting nutrition. So you're getting them to grow at a higher rate to reduce that mortality risk. And then, you know, I look at growth rate targets for sort of performance. So when we're looking, so just to give you some idea of these weights, so I've given you in that top graph, you've got your adult weight in kilograms at 60 kilos. So we look at your birth weight target at sort of 8 to 9% of your standard reference weight. So at 5 kilos, weaning at 45%, which is your target, means you'd be weaning at 27 kilos. And joining as a minimum of 80% of standard reference weight. So by joining, we want them at 48 kilos. So 70 kilo standard reference weight, you've got your 5.5 at birth for a single is your target, 31.5 kilos at weaning and 52 kilos at joining. So obviously with that 31.5 kilos, you are going to have those animals that are a bit younger, that are going to be behind, but they're the ones you can draft off and manage a little bit more effectively. Where your animals that have hit their 45% target still need correct nutrition, but they're often going to thrive fairly well if they've got to that target weaning weight. So what we look at is with a standard hog at joining. So from birth to weaning, with that 70 kilo standard reference weight ewe, to hit that weaning target of 31.5, they're needing to grow at 265 grams a day. And that should be relatively achievable with a merino lamb. So provided your ewes have had correct nutrition through the lactation period, I find a lot of merino lambs will grow at sort of 300 grams a day. But it's obviously making sure you've got that nutrition right, especially for your ewes that have had twin lambs. So then if we're going to join them at 18 months of age, we only need them to grow at that minimum of 50 grams a day. But as I said, post-weaning, I'd prefer them to be growing a little more than that, but they'll easily hit their targets if they're growing, 50 to 100 grams over that period. But when we look at joining ewe lambs, so getting them to that 80% target by 7 months of age, we're still trying to get that 265 grams to get them to 31.5 kilos. And then you need to keep them growing at 210 grams a day as an absolute minimum through to joining. So, that's where we need to continue that targeted nutrition ongoing. And obviously, if they're weather lambs that you're trying to turn off, we probably target even more growth than that per day to get them off the farm quickly. So I encourage you guys, to put these figures together yourself. So, write down your target weaning weight, write down your target adult weight when you're wanting to join and what weight you're wanting them. And, anyone with weighing gear, it can be good to look at what you're hitting and what your spread of weights is also. So when we look at nutritional requirements to meet these needs and get these high growth rates, so I talk a lot about the top of that triangle. So we'll talk a little bit about energy. So energy is basically what an animal needs to maintain their condition or put on condition. So, when we talk about pregnant ewes, lactating ewes, we focus a lot on energy requirements. So that's measured in megajoules per kilo dry matter, and I'll go into a little bit how that works. But I'm also going to touch on protein. So with your weaner lambs, crude protein is very important. So crude protein is what an animal needs when they're basically trying to build muscle and growth. So, lactating ewes need protein, and also growing animals have a very high protein requirement. The last one there is your NDF, which is your neutral detergent fibre. So we'll talk a little bit about fibre requirement, especially when animals go on to real lush feeds. And I won't touch on them substantially, but there are sort of mineral requirements depending on what pastures you're grazing and what the deficiencies might be. So when we talk about energy, I first like to talk about digestibility. So when we're looking at, hopefully most of you now have reasonable pastures to wean your animals onto, or that you're growing weaners out on at the moment. So when we talk about digestibility, we're just looking at the proportion of the pasture the animal can utilise. So quite a high digestible pasture, which is pretty similar to where most of our cereals that are sown for grazing, or a lot of our permanent pastures are sitting at the moment. They're probably sitting in that 65 to 75% digestibility range. So that means if they're eating, a cow example, 10 kilos, we'll go back to a ewe eating 1 kilo. It means they're going to use 700 grams, and 300 grams is going to go through in their dung. But when we get to dry feed, digestibility goes right down. So if you look at this sort of feed situation over a year, once we get to February and March, we're down to that sort of 40% digestible feed, which means, they're utilising 400 grams out of every kilo, and 600 grams is going through to their manure. So there's a direct correlation between digestibility and energy in megajoules per kilo dry matter. So as I said, at the moment, in most areas, we're in this reasonable high quality pasture. So we're looking in that, August coming through to September period where you should be over 70% digestibility, and anything with a legume base or percent legumes is likely to be at the top end of that digestibility, closer to 80%. So we're looking at our feed giving us sort of 10 to 12 megajoules of energy per kilo of dry matter in the paddock. So to put that in perspective, a standard 60 kilo sort of ewe needs 10 megajoules to maintain their condition, or a weaner sort of needs 10 to 12 megajoules a day to grow. So when we're looking at our pastures, we need to just make sure we can meet our requirements for those animals to keep growing, and obviously that you've got adequate quantity. So as I said, protein can really be the limiting factor in weaner growth rate. And I think it's because we're so used to sort of talking energy, especially around ewes, and making sure we're meeting energy targets. But the problem with when you're trying to build growth or build muscle on an animal, you really need that high protein ration. So as you can see there, we've got crude protein measured as a percentage of the feed. Once you get below that 10% protein, it's really limiting your growth rate. So you're not going to get those high growth rates. So we see the green line there is just your maintenance. So as your energy goes up, you're needing that protein. So wanting them to grow at 50 grams a day, we're needing higher protein again. But if we're really trying to push growth, you'd need to be around that sort of 14 to 16% protein. So it can be your protein holding you back. And that's for a standard sort of 30 kilo lamb. So if you have weaned a 15 to 20 kilo weaner, their protein requirement is substantially higher. So you could be looking at sort of 18% protein in a targeted ration for a really light weaner. So if you are weaning in a drought situation, or you've got some really light weaners, it could be worth getting some advice around putting together a specific ration that'll get them to grow quite quickly to those target rates. So just going to run through a few sort of feed tests of some pastures I've sort of seen over the last 3 or 4 weeks, mostly around the mid-north and further north, but just to show you sort of the quality. So, I feed test a lot of pastures for sort of farm groups, because it just gives you some idea of where this feed's sort of sitting. So we've got here just some green oats, just not far out of the mid-north. A couple of weeks ago, so everything's finally started to grow a little bit more here. But you can see there, the issue with these short grain feeds, this one's only 18.6% dry matter. So that means every kilo of feed the animal's eating, they're getting over 800 grams of water and 186 grams of dry matter. So this height's fine, but when you do have that shorter grain feed for weaners, often they have to harvest a lot of it, and they're processing a lot of water to get the energy and protein they need out of that feed. So that's where you'll see them sort of scouring, struggling to adjust, especially if they've come off quite different feed and then gone onto a paddock like this. So you can see, as far as a protein amount, we've got a lot of protein in these short grain feeds. So this is 29% protein as a percentage of dry matter. So we'll definitely meet weaner targets, and they often end up basically wasting excess protein because they just don't have enough energy to process it all. But as far as meeting your minimum protein targets, no need to put any protein in that at all. The next thing we look at on a feed test is this neutral detergent fibre. So some of your brassicas and some of your sort of clovers or hotter pastures, or your real short green pick, will be much lower in fibre. So as a minimum fibre, we're looking at over 30% fibre content. So if you're not getting that, you're needing to put some hay or some other roughage just to slow the rate of that feed through the rumen. So, this one's not too bad at 45.8% fibre, so it's just starting to harden up and get a bit more fibre through it. And you can see there your digestibility just over 70%. So that's giving us pretty good energy of 10.5 megajoules per kilo dry matter. So, you know, if your weaner's hitting, eating a kilo of dry matter a day, which they can easily access in that paddock, they'll be getting, you know, 10 plus megajoules a day, which will allow them to hit your minimum growth targets. So another point, you know, often I see sort of one really nice paddock of sown cereals or a really nice paddock of brassicas, some ryegrass maybe, and the weaners have never been on it. The mum's pulled away, they're throwing on this great weaner paddock, but it actually takes 2 weeks for the rumen bugs to adjust to a new feed. So in an ideal world, without your ewes having any worm burdens they're dropping on the paddock, I'd prefer to introduce lambs with their mums and then basically take the mums away so the lambs are left and they're already adjusted to that feed type before the stress of weaning. But obviously managing worm burdens, that isn't always the best scenario. So, you know, in an ideal world, you'd have ewes and lambs on a very similar feed and either move the weaners next door into a clean paddock or take the mums away if you're not dealing with worm burdens. So, and then once the weaners are adjusted to that feed, often I'll also see they've got a great paddock of brassica, you know, within 3-4 weeks it's gone, and then the animals are put back onto a cereal or back onto a hills feed or onto something else. So you need to try and think a little bit about continuity of feed for those weaners too. So once you've got the rumen bugs sort of working, they're processing that feed, they're not scaring, the animals are growing and thriving, it's not ideal to suddenly put them onto a totally different feed and start that process all over again. So especially when we're trying to hit really high growth rates, keeping the feed continuity as close as you can to similar types of feed is brilliant. So this is another perennial pasture just a little bit further north. So a little bit patchy there as bare ground, but this was about 6 weeks ago, was a lambing paddock and there wasn't much else in many other sown paddocks, so filled a pretty good gap. So we had sort of 1,400 kilos of dry matter hectare quite early in this paddock. So this was a mix of Phalaris, 3 clovers, lucerne and chicory, and it was planted about 4 years ago. So a true perennial in sort of probably borderline 450 mil rainfall. But when we look at dry matter percent of this one, so there was a bit of dead, bit of remnant leaf. So dry matter a little bit higher at just over 22%. Protein still really good. So this had lactating twin ewes on it and lambs, but still perfect for weaner lambs. So they will wean onto a paddock of the same feed. So nearly 18% protein. Digestibility at just over 60%. So energy is a little bit lower, but still will meet pretty good targets for a weaner lamb. And you can see there your fibre with a bit of that dead leaf come up quite high at 50%. So, you know, sometimes we'll use hay and things to adjust them to feeds like this, but, you know, in this case, there's plenty of fibre in that pasture, so they shouldn't really be chasing extra fibre. So as I said, unfortunately, you know, some of the paddocks I'm sort of dealing with further north, you know, there's other areas that just haven't had the rainfall. So we're not really seeing enough value or enough feed in paddocks. So, you know, if you really don't have enough feed, it can be better to lock them in a smaller area and sort of give them a very precise ration that meets their nutritional needs. But, you know, ideally animals will be put into a paddock, you know, after, you know, so, you know, yard weaning can be an effective tool to reduce stress for that sort of couple of days after weaning. But, you know, after that, I prefer them to go out onto a paddock of green, if at all possible, if the season allows. But, you know, as we said, sometimes your pastures aren't exactly what a weaner needs. So I encourage you to sort of look at weaner requirements and then look at, you know, if you are on very lush green, you know, 20% NDF type pasture, then putting out some high quality hay or some oats can make a big difference to how they utilise that feed. Energy, so if you're low on energy, so often I find some really hot, so, you know, sometimes pastures we put in to graze, like pure vetches, brassicas and clovers and things, are more, you know, to control grasses as a break for a cropping program than what they are for animal requirement reasons. So often with those sort of feeds, they're very high in protein. Energy can be a bit of a deficiency. So I quite like for weaners, especially if they've been imprinted with their mum, just leaving a feeder out with them for sort of 200 to 300 grams of, oats or barley in a feeder. So that'll give them a bit of extra fibre, a bit of energy to break down the protein in the feed, but it'll also give them some continuity of feed from pre-weaning through to sort of post-weaning, to allow the rumen bugs then to adjust to that new green feed as well. And the other one's protein. So if you're weaning a bit later and the spring, does cut off, and your feed starts to deteriorate, digestibility goes down, you're on dry feed, then, be careful protein's not holding back your growth rate. So that's the three things I encourage you to look at. And, as I said, there are some mineral requirements. So, grazing cereals, for example, are very deficient in magnesium. So adding a magnesium lick can help a lot with weaner growth rate on those types of feeds. So in summary, I just encourage you to look at your weaning time. So, if you haven't planned it out, look at when you started lambing, provided you've done a 5 to 6 week sort of joining, you can look at that 14 weeks post-weaning as your optimum weaning time. But definitely don't be scared off if you're running out of feed, if there's dry conditions. Get some advice on early weaning, because me and a lot of other consultants have had a lot of success in still getting a very good result for people, and it can just enable you to keep that high quality pasture longer for the animals that need it, which is the weaners. So I guess making a plan, so ensuring you've done the right thing by health, so looking at your worm egg counts, an effective drench, your appropriate vaccinations, and then method of weaning. So, having a nice paddock that you're going to settle them down into, or, a yard weaning type process where you might get them used to you and the dogs for a couple of days, let them sort of get their mob together before you let them out, can be effective also. But then also paddock selection. So getting the right paddock for the weaners, that they've been used to the water, that you're not changing everything for them. And also that imprint feeding. So training them on their mum, that can get them used to the feed out cart, you coming out, filling out the feeder, running around checking them. It can just basically get them used to what their life's going to be like going ahead, but will also give you the benefit of the rumen development and the feed efficiency that sort of follows them then for the rest of their life. So once you have weaned, just monitoring your weight gains. So it can be great to get an average weaning weight, and then, I love nothing more than sort of 6 to 8 weeks post-weaning, doing another weight of them and just making sure you have gained weight over that period. If you have had substantial weight loss or weight gains are a lot lower than what you thought, get some help and try and identify why. Because, when we're looking at targets for whether lambs, joining ewe lambs, that weaning period, if they're losing 2 to 5 kilos rather than putting it on in those first few weeks, it can make a substantial difference to whether they're going to hit targets for you or not. And then identifying the feed you have and whether it's going to give them the growth they need. So basically whether you've hit fibre, energy, protein targets, or whether there's anything you need to add. But thanks for your time tonight. That's all I sort of wanted to cover. So I'll hand back to Jodie and happy to take any questions from anyone.
A couple here, Deb. One, you talked about worm egg counts, and it's actually a question I've had a bit just in the last week or two from people about where to source worm egg count information and a test. Did you want to provide some insight into that?
So most of your resellers often have kits. So if you've got a local reseller and you're sort of chasing a kit, which will have the sort of wells that you can put the fecal samples in, ask your reseller. But a lot of those actually go interstate. So over COVID times, I've started using a local lady in Adelaide, just because postage times have been so quick. So she's quite unofficial, so I don't think you'd really be able to look her up, but she's accredited. But it's Liz Ockleshaw, and I'm happy to provide the form and her details to anyone, or Jodie can distribute it. But the benefit of doing it within the state I've found is if you've got ewes and lambs near yards, for example, you'll get a really quick result. So the night she gets them, you'll get a result back. So it's brilliant from that side of things. But yeah, happy to share if you want to send me an email and I'll send you back the details.
Fantastic, Deb. We might get those and we'll pop those on the end of the webinar. The other place to have a look at is on the Worm Boss website. So there's a list of suppliers and further information about worm egg counts on the Worm Boss website. So yeah, jump on there and have a look as well. But yeah, your resellers often have those kits. So thanks, Deb. Got a question here. Person's losing a few weaners and a few limpy ones. They're grazing medics. They've got access to oats and straw. Any thoughts to where they should go next? And what might be?
Yeah, so medics and then, lush feed, wet feed. You can often get wet feed, hoof abscess and things, which can make them a bit limpy, but it could also be due to hot feed. So, as I said, with some of your pure medics vetches, they're probably not ideal from an animal health perspective. So feeder of oats has done the right thing. Sometimes it's hard to get them onto the oats. It's hard to know if they were introduced prior to weaning, but hopefully they were. Because that would be a bit of an issue if they weren't, because the lambs potentially won't go over to them. But I'd probably replace the straw with really good quality cereal hay as well. With higher legume diets, you can get issues like red gut, and it's just because the feed is so highly digestible, it passes really quickly through their system. And red gut's then just basically a twist in the gut that you can have losses. So the key is to have some diversity in the pasture. So, a bit of oats, bit of good quality hay will hopefully help slow that down and prevent issues like that from occurring. But yeah, I'd be looking at worm burdens and pulpy kidney. You'd have to tick all those health things off first, that you've done everything best practice, really.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Deb, that's all the questions I've got. I'm also just mindful of time. We did start a bit later this evening than what we normally do. I also want to just acknowledge our funders that support SheepConnect SA. That's AWI, the South Australian Sheep Industry Fund, and Primary Industries and Regions. I thank everyone who joined us for today's webinar. Deb, I thank you for sharing your insight and expertise. If people have got any additional questions they might think about later on this evening or tomorrow, you can contact me directly through the contact information on your webinar. I thank you for your time in attending our webinar, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. So thank you and good evening.